All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for coming today and joining us for our GWSC Deep Dive webinar series. Today, we're talking with Dr. Melissa McCracken. She's at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Dr. Marcus King, he's at Georgetown University, and the Global Water Security Center's own Penny Beams. And we're going to be talking today about water wars. My name's Kate Brauman. I'm the Deputy Director here at GWSC. And I'm your host today. So I'm going to be moderating this conversation. Here at GWSC, we're housed at the University of Alabama, and we're dedicated to translating water science for environmental security. And that's exactly why we wanted to talk about water wars today. Our aim is to serve as a bridge between scientists and key government and military officials to inform decisions at the intersection of water, food, energy, and health. You can learn more about GWSC at ua-gwsc.org. Today, we're going to talk about all kinds of elements of water wars. We're going to start out with our panelists talking about some of the more nuanced facets of water wars. That's going to include some of the data. What do we actually know about these conflicts? Thinking about transboundary conflicts and how those are similar and different to intrastate conflicts. And even some cooperation around water. It's not all wars. We're going to start out today. I'm going to ask our panelists some questions to sort of get us all on the same page, make sure that we get some basic information and thoughts out there. And then as we move through the webinar, we'll have about 20 minutes at the end of the hour for your questions. So please submit your questions. You can do so through the Q&A function or the chat function. And I will be able to see those questions and I can read them out to our panelists when we get to the Q&A portion. So definitely be thinking about what you're interested in and please do submit those questions. I think you may not have a choice about this, but as we begin our webinar, make sure your microphone is muted and your video is off. We are recording this webinar and it will be available on the GWSC website and our social media platforms. So to get started, you've heard who I am, and I want to give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. So I'm going to turn it over first to Melissa to please say hello and introduce herself.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa McCracken. I'm an assistant professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. So nice rainy Boston spring day. And as part of my role as an assistant professor with the Fletcher School, I also direct the Shared Waters Lab, and I'm a member of the Center for International Environmental Research and Policy, or CERP, here at the Fletcher School. And my research interest really centers on transboundary waters. So how do we cooperate? What does conflict look like over transboundary international shared freshwater rivers and aquifers?
Fabulous. Marcus, will you say hello?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Marcus King. I'm a professor, as was said, at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And I also run a new master's program, which is Masters of Science in Environment and International Affairs, where we're bringing in our first cohort for the one-year program. My experience comes from government and think tanks as well as academia. I've worked at the Department of Defense, Department of Energy. But what I really focus on is climate security, but I found that water is kind of the most immediate and visceral impact of climate change, which has brought me to be focused a little more on droughts and dry areas, so Middle East, North Africa, and then also more sort of importantly at the national level or subnational levels where I've really looked at water issues. And I teach environmental security courses.
Fantastic. Penny, will you say hello?
Yeah, so I'm Penny, and I am a human environmental analyst at the Global Water Security Center. My background, I started off researching predominantly transboundary river sharing, mostly in the Indus River Basin. And then from there, I moved from the policy side over to the science side and started studying how dams affect human and non-human systems. So when I came to the Global Water Security Center, what I thought was so exciting was that I got to bring two very disparate sides of this whole conversation together in order to produce insights. And since I've been here, I've been working on our Pathways to Impact framework to parse exactly how water shocks lead to conflict or other types of outcomes.
Fantastic. So we are here today. We have convinced both our panelists and everyone in the audience to come today to talk about water wars. But I think we need to figure out what we're actually talking about. Are there water wars? What's actually happening? And Melissa, I know you've been actually collecting data on some of this. So can you provide some background for us on what's actually going on?
Absolutely, happy to. So most everybody is probably very familiar with the water wars narrative. So you've heard quotes in the news or in the media. Vice President Kamala Harris, for example, just a couple of years ago said that, water is the new oil. The next war we're going to fight is over water. And so that's a common theme that we often really hear within the news media in particular. And ultimately, we see that there's a challenge to this because there hasn't been a water war in nearly 5,000 years. So I see two main challenges really when we start digging into the meat of the idea of a water war and to structure our background discussion. The first challenge is thinking about how water is actually addressed with respect to conflict. So are we talking about water being the cause or the trigger of that particular conflict? Are we talking about water being a casualty or a victim of that conflict? And then is water actually a weapon? And is it utilized in some sort of strategic way in order to imbue harm, for example? Often those three things get conflated, but when we're talking about a water war, we're really focusing in on water being that cause or the trigger or the reason for conflict occurring. So that's one of the main reasons why I think this narrative has continued to be perpetuated, as we tend to conflate the other two. The second is the scales. So what scale are we actually talking about? When we generally think about water wars, we are generally referring to the interstate scale, so country to country interactions, conflict over water. And as I mentioned before, the last conflict, true war that we had where water was the cause was actually 4,500 BC, so 4,500 BC, between Lagash and Umma, which are two Sumerian city-states. And so they fought a particular war over boundary waters and an irrigation canal. And that actually resulted in what we consider to be the very first transboundary water agreement as well, which is actually more common, the cooperative nature of transboundary waters. And so that's generally what we're seeing in the research today. So in the 1990s, when the water wars narrative was really picking up, a group of researchers led by Aaron Wolf at Oregon State University started thinking about, well, let's actually measure this. And so they collected data looking at events or news articles where we could track the interactions between states over transboundary waters and categorize them on a scale of intensity. So cooperation all the way down to all-out full-scale war between these countries. And they found that collecting that data from about the mid-1800s all the way up into today, and we're currently collecting new data for that same project so we can continue with more recent trends. And we found that there hasn't been a war over water with that recent data. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been conflict. It's usually lower scale, low intensity conflict, but we also find that cooperation is much more common than conflict over water. So that's what our current data is showing. And this relates back to the second point I was making about scale, which is that we tend to conflate the fact that there's conflict or violence in particular at the subnational or even interpersonal scales as a water war, rather than just strictly thinking about the interstate scale. And so we tend to see that there's actually more likely to be conflict at the interstate scale, at the intrastate scale than there is at the interstate scale. So that's kind of where I see the kind of framing our water wars background.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is that we're not really seeing all-out war, but there are other kinds of conflict that are happening. And
Absolutely.
Certainly as we listen to the news, we're hearing about a lot of conflict that's happening, often in places where there's not sufficient water. So Marcus, you've looked at some of this and some of the changing patterns in conflict connected to water. What seems like it's actually happening here?
Right. So yeah, the water wars narrative has been sort of overhyped. both in the media and even looking at the secretaries general of the UN, the last 3 or 4 have all said, again, the next war will be over water. And so while this obviously isn't the case at the interstate level, the research I've done and a lot of what I've been reading recently has found that conflict, not necessarily water war, is becoming more prevalent. So there is more, prevalence of conflict. But water conflict, as Melissa already said, can take many forms, and it can involve many actors, besides states, including states. And so that goes all the way from the level of, what I call bellicose rhetoric between national leaders, all the way to litigation, which could be seen as a form of conflict, civil unrest, continuing to go up the scale, but also less frequently strikes and protests and even armed conflict. And so what's also interesting is that while cooperation is more prevalent than conflict itself, there's sorts of water cooperation between actors that might discriminate against a third actor, leading to sort of a conflictual situation. And this has been, articulated by one of my colleagues here at Georgetown as domination dressed up as cooperation when that happens. So there's still kind of a structural way in which cooperation can lead to adverse outcomes, of others. But then why has water conflict become more prevalent? My theory is that it has to do with water becoming scarcer. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I think are accelerating. Globally, there's population growth, which is increased demand. So, overdrawing of aquifers. But then there's climate change induced factors like drought and desertification, and also increasingly irregular weather patterns. So the monsoons have been, irregular, which has led to some food insecurity and other issues in certain regions. But where I see this really playing out, again, that's been sort of referenced, is at the subnational level. So not so much interstate, but intrastate. And so that's where my research has really been focused. So I've written a book recently that came out in February 2023, which is really looking at subnational conflict and violent extremist organizations. And so, at that level, I've seen this beginning to happen in drought-stricken regions, especially Middle East, North Africa, but also in Syria. So I wanted to bring up the Syria example.
Yeah, that's one that people talk about a lot.
Absolutely.
There's a lot more going on than the top line narrative, huh?
Absolutely. And so I think, the backstory behind the claims is that, people claim that climate change through the mechanism of water has been sort of the prevalent reason for the war. And I see it, in the case studies that I've done, which include Nigeria, Somalia, and Syria, as really being more of a water stress and conflict cycle, where you see water stressors creating physical impacts like groundwater depletion, drought, desertification, which then can lead to these systemic outcomes, including reduction in agricultural productivity or food insecurity. And in the case of Syria, it did lead to some migration and some civil unrest, where you had farmers that were in the south of the country who, whose land became less productive, who then moved to the periphery of these cities in the north. But what's the key factor, though, has been discrimination against certain groups. So these were Sunni Muslims that were discriminated against by the Alawite minority, which was what Assad belonged to. And so that this has to be seen in light also of not only the discrimination, but also poor water policies and other policies of the Syrian government. So that's really important. And one of those policies was subsidization of diesel fuel, and diesel fuel being used for pumping of water, and then also just the way that water wasn't allocated in a fair way. But again, what I've looked at more so is how violent non-state actors have been connected to water. And so even within the sort of theater of Syria and Iraq, I've seen ways in which water has been weaponized, by these subnational groups. And So this is really sort of seen itself out according to different ways that I've categorized. So this could be on a strategic level where water's being manipulated by in terms of large infrastructure by subnational groups. So this was a way that ISIS in particular was able to gain control of virtual territory, or maybe more importantly, to coerce populations, and to use water as a source of revenue in order to sort of fund their caliphate project at that time. So that's one way that I've seen water being used. But then also, I think, as Melissa kind of alluded to, also tactically on the battlefield. So, intentional diversion of water, has been done by Al-Shabaab, which is another group I looked at, sort of diverting the course of the lower Juba River at one point, which dislodged Kenyan peacekeepers and American soldiers, and allowed them to have more of an advantage on the battlefield. Looking at, also on the battlefield, I did a study on Boko Haram, and they had even child soldiers doing things like poisoning wells. And so that was another aspect of the war there. So essentially I've seen it as a strategy of coercion by subnational actors, and not so much, again, on the interstate level or transboundary water courses where a lot of the work's been done, a lot of the thinking's been done about lack of allocation or allocation of shared waters, but really looking at climate-driven impacts at this subnational level, especially, again, in the area that I know, which is the Middle East and North Africa.
Great. So, part of what Melissa's been pointing out is that when we actually look at this large body of data that are available, that we're not really seeing wars, we are seeing conflict, we're also seeing cooperation. Marcus, thank you. I think you've really sort of fleshed out that story of there are many other elements that we need to take into account as we're thinking about this. So I want to ask you, Penny, as you come into this as an analyst with GWSC, how are you making sense of this? How are you operationalizing this? What does this mean for somebody who's sitting in an office somewhere and is not a water expert? What do they need to know?
Yeah, it's it's such a complex story. Like, what's going through my head now is the top line narrative that you get from high level officials, from the media, is this, like, the model is very simple. It's like, we have water scarcity, then we have conflict. And what's missing is all of the complexity that Melissa and Marcus have just described. But what is so challenging about that complexity is it is by its very nature complex. So one of the things that we're building is this Pathways to Impact framework that creates this subset of buckets that we can use to parse the complexity of the direct impacts of a water shock, be that a drought or a flood, the way those impacts are manifested on people and the landscape, kind of like these second order impacts, like food insecurity that we're talking about, or, like massive livelihood impacts. And then how do those physical impacts intersect with things like discrimination, this section that we call the tinderbox? So, like, what are the opportunities being presented by a water shock? Like, is there a shakeup in the social contract that non-state actors can make use of in order to increase their strength or status? Or are food insecurity issues that are driven by these climate and water impacts aggravating existing grievances between politically excluded groups or socially excluded groups? And then the spark we consider is, like, who is motivating this? Like, a child soldier didn't just decide to go poison a well. Someone had to orchestrate that. They had to recruit that soldier. They had to decide that the tactic they were going to employ was water-based. And so we call those types of folks the sparks, the human driver of this conflict. And then the combination of water shock through these impacts, and then, like, through the prism of the people who are motivating these conflicts and the grievances or opportunities they're leveraging, will then decide the outcome. So if we can take this complex system or scenario and organize all of these elements into these little buckets, it's a much more straightforward story to give to a policymaker that they can then use to try to design interventions. You know, depending on what tools they have available to them, they can see themselves in some of these different parts of the process.
Excellent. So what this spurs for me is a question about scale. You know, we've talked about interstate conflict, we've talked about intrastate conflict, and it seems like we know a lot more about the transboundary. Can we translate that to the subnational level? Why are they different? And what do we need to know to understand what we can learn from one or the other? Melissa, I don't know if you've thought about this in your work. Marcus, I'm guessing you've started to, but Melissa, if you want to kick us off with that.
I think that's a challenging question, and absolutely, I would 100% agree that the transboundary is way more studied than the subnational over water conflict and then water cooperation, and so I think there are some transferable lessons, and that's something that we've proposed in some of our own work about what can we try and apply some of these learnings. So one of the main hypotheses that we have out of the transboundary literature, particularly the event study that I was talking about earlier, is that the potential for reducing the likelihood of conflict is relative to the amount of institutional capacity that's within a particular basin. So the greater the institutional capacity, the more that system has the ability to absorb any sort of shock to that system, like Penny was mentioning. And so we think that we're able to show that empirically with the data at the transboundary scale, but it makes sense that that could also be applied to the subnational scale. The application of that and how do we test it and how do we gather all the data, those are questions we're still trying to answer and figure out, and hopefully be able to model this at a large scale analysis. But that's kind of the idea moving forward, is maybe we can take that same principle and try and figure out, well, what are the core components of institutional capacity at the subnational scale that are equivalent at the international scale?
So
I wanted
yeah,
to
go
say,
ahead, Marcus.
sorry, go ahead. I mean, one thing that strikes me also might come out of the environmental peace building literature or peacemaking, you know, is the idea that cooperation over shared watercourses between nations or between, you know, entities has tended to lead and open up conversations about peace in other areas. And so I think that, you know, some of the work of groups like EcoPeace in the Middle East between, you know, the Jordanians, Palestinians, Israelis, you know, might also translate into the subnational level. You know, so there are these opportunities for peace building around, you know, the first thing that seems to be most important in post-conflict situations, which is rebuilding water and water infrastructure. So I think that, you know, I haven't thought about this much, but that strikes me as one of the areas where there could be an analogous relationship between the international and the subnational.
And so then with something like the non-state violent actors, is there any parallel? Is there anything that we can learn from the transboundary work, or are they kind of a different entity that we need to think about addressing in a totally different way?
Yeah, so I mean, the work that I've done, I think about the sort of levers or aspects of U.S. policy. So that comes down to defense, development, and diplomacy. And I think at the diplomatic level, you know, there is a sort of a treaty architecture out there that regulates the use of water in conflict. That, you know, there's the Environmental Modification Treaty, the wars over, the laws over the actual conduct of war, like the Geneva Conventions. And so this is something that might be an effective lever at the interstate level, but then obviously, you know, subnational actors, especially violent extremist organizations, don't see themselves as constrained or subject to international law regulating armed conflict. So I think you have to get to the other D's. And so there's development. And so I think, you know, development as a tool of conflict prevention is something that's beginning to get a little more emphasis and getting looked at. by groups like USAID, through things like the Global Fragility Act, which is meant to actually, hedge against violence and extremism. And then being able to think about climate resilient projects or water resilient projects that can then sort of alleviate these conditions at the subnational level that will help to ameliorate, the actions that are related to conflict. And then the third, which I've spent sort of the most time on, though, is defense. And so thinking about water and how it's being used at the subnational level should be a really important part of CVE strategy, so countering violent extremism. And groups like the combatant commands, need to think about how water can be abused or misused in order to try to get out in front of that and to incorporate that into their strategies on the ground.
I think going back to, sorry, Melissa.
No, go ahead, Penny.
Real quick. Going back to the development piece that Marcus just raised, that ties into this idea of addressing existing grievances. So like we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about, grievances, and if development can be used as a tool to alleviate some of the like real material water effects that are exacerbating certain grievances, make people feel like they're being taken care of either by the government, some sort of international aid organization, there's less for the spark people who are organizing conflict to draw on. Conflict is really expensive. Personally, at the community level, like you have to overcome some pretty major hurdles in order to draw people into a conflict, which gets easier if your grievance level is really high. But if that grievance has been ameliorated in some way, the sparks can call for conflict all they like. Very few people are going to show up.
I think too, the kind of flip side of the development issue as well is that adding these non-state actors can also become more legitimate through providing development of water resources. So we see that a lot with Boko Haram did that in the Lake Chad Basin, FARC did that in Colombia, where they're providing water infrastructure, and so kind of creating a bit more legitimacy to themselves. So it's a double-edged sword, I feel like, in how we can try and help to prevent conflict, but then also development can provide legitimacy for these groups, depending on how they're interfacing with the communities.
There were similar impacts after the floods in Pakistan as Islamic extremists making inroads by offering emergency aid that the government was ill-equipped to provide.
So we're talking about these non-state violent actors, and we've been talking about the MENA region. And what about in some of the other places? Penny, you and I have talked a little bit about France, and I heard there's some farmers who are getting really up in arms about reservoirs.
Yeah, so I think the water entry gives us this really interesting vantage into places that are not among the usual suspects. And like the massive farmer protests happening across Europe, I think, are a really good example. But there's this one particular instance a year or two ago where in order to try to manage the impacts of the ongoing droughts in France, the French government was going to build a series of surface water reservoirs in order to, keep farmers going through these dry periods. And the neighboring citizens were absolutely up in arms, and the French know how to protest, so things got really violent. And their take was, these are corporate farms that are getting public resources, like water is a common good, and so the government is coming in and privatizing this common good water resource for these corporate farms, and that means that us as the citizens of this region are getting less access to what we see as our common right to access to water. And so we're seeing these really interesting these really interesting flame ups in places where you wouldn't customarily look. Like, it's not Africa, it's not the Middle East. And I mean, I live in Canada, and we're having a really bad drought over the farming provinces. of Saskatchewan and Alberta. And like, it's probably going to get really bad. And farmers and rural citizens were the driving force behind the 2022 convoy to Ottawa. So we know that these people can be organized. They're highly networked. They're often networked through church groups. And so I suspect that we're going to see like farmer-centered water or drought-driven conflict here in Canada in the coming months.
So, Melissa, you're collecting a lot of data, transboundary at this point, but as you look at that, do you see patterns about places where conflict or cooperation is changing? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so we've been collecting data on the events, looking at the scale from conflict to cooperation. We're in the process of collecting a new batch of data. And so we're still working through that preliminarily, so we don't have the results from the newest set of data at this point. But there are a few trends that we do see. One of the big ones at the transboundary scale is we're more likely to see conflict occurring where there's low institutional capacity and there's some sort of rapid change that's happening to the system. The general proxy that we usually use, like in calculations, for example, is the presence of a planned or proposed construction of some sort of large infrastructure project. So a dam, a large-scale diversion, generally is kind of what we're looking for. And so we tend to see that those are more likely going to be the trigger. And generally is something that's rapid. A longer scale onset, something that's chronic, is at the transboundary scale, at least, is less likely to cause a higher level of intensity of conflict. It might cause lower levels of intensity of conflict. We've also seen some interesting research that's looking at the kind of level of humidity or aridity of an area relative to conflict and cooperation. And we generally see kind of a U-shaped curve with respect to that, where you're actually more likely to have cooperation in places that are very humid or wet, as well as really more arid areas. And the conflict is actually more within those middle or temperate climates. And so the scarcity at the transboundary level can trigger both conflict, but it can also actually be a push towards more cooperation because the resource is limited, and it's more likely that states will try and cooperate over that shared resource.
Marcus, do you think you're seeing trends like that with some of the work that you've been doing, or are there other sort of trends or patterns that you're seeing?
So trends like what again? Sorry.
So, Melissa was saying that it's not necessarily how good the institutional support is, but how does that compare to places that are changing really rapidly? Or places where you talked a little bit about the variation that climate change is bringing, the transboundary scale, that seems to really matter.
Yeah, I mean, there are some conditions which I call harbingers of conflict, and I think Melissa hit exactly on one, which is the sort of threat of unilateral infrastructure development, which could be dams, and then also in an area where you have existing cleavages, which can be ethnic, sectarian, or could be economical. So you have differences in class structure. And so I see these coming together, but then to me, sort of at maybe the top of that pyramid might be again climate change. So climate change is kind of a forcer which comes in to aggravate some of these other parts that are below I think on the pyramid, which include again disparities in society, and then also rapid infrastructure development. And then another one I think I've seen in the literature a bit is when there's rapid changes in precipitation. So it's not necessarily whether it's dry for a while or more temperate climate, but it's this idea again of changes that occur rapidly, and then sort of the inability maybe of the agricultural sector, to keep up with the different timing of the rains in, that respect.
We're gonna be moving to questions pretty soon, so I saw we just got one, but I would love to encourage folks to ask questions. That's gonna make this more fun. But before we move to that, Penny, do you want to comment on any of this before we move to questions?
Yeah, I think I would go back to this idea of interventions, and something that is super interesting about the framework is that it does highlight, like, depending on what tools you have in your toolbox, do you have like diplomatic tools at your disposal? Are you more of a development organization? Are you looking at defense? It's hard to know when the situation is really complex where those tools apply. But if you know that certain water shocks lead to specific kinds of direct impacts in places where, like Marcus was saying, you have these, group cleavages that could become inflamed somehow. If you can parse out all of the different elements that lead up to the grievance and what might spark that, it's easier to apply your tools. So if you have development tools, you can go into a region where you know that, like, if we have, like, what we're doing at GWSC is, like, we have the science now to see, are rapid changes happening in terms of precipitation or temperature or aridity or these things. Like, we can kind of monitor based on what we know are the elements that go into creating these types of conflicts, and then point decision makers and policymakers with these specific toolboxes to, like, right to the place where we're like, we know that we can alleviate some of the grievance in XYZ place if we just, like, if we just support some institutional capacity to increase resilience to floods, say. Not necessarily in terms of just infrastructure, but like community infrastructure, and the other thing is like, often the perception is just as important as the reality. There's a lot of research that says that even if change isn't happening, if you can convince people that change is happening, they will behave in the same way as if that change were real. And I think the flip side is the same way. Like, if you can convince people that they are being taken care of, that resilience is happening, and there is some stability coming for their lives despite these shocks that might be occurring, they will behave accordingly. We are group creatures.
I just wanted to add to that. I think another important thing besides sort of defense development diplomacy is that has to do with institutional capacity, is being able to provide data and also things that support early warning capabilities. There's only 50 countries in the world I was reading that have early warning capabilities, and things like the famine early warning system, for example, that is more focused right now on Africa, but being able to integrate the tools for early warning, which include things like remote sensing, data processing, and then being able to not only provide that data to countries that need it for preparedness, but provide it also to the people on the ground that need to have it beside, just the central government. So thinking about how those tools can play into conflict prevention around water is also really important.
Knowledge is power.
Well, this is a nice segue into our first question, which is really about interventions, crafting a strategic diplomatic agenda, thinking at the subnational level. So, as states look at their own subnational level, what do we need to do? So there's some really interesting ideas in this question: creating opportunities for dissenting voices, particularly as tensions escalate over water distribution, potential impact of political regime shifts, cooperative mechanisms, looking at the context of, Spain and Portugal in particular, is this question. But I think that this broader question of kind of, what do we do if you were a state, if you were going to provide some suggestions to a state about, like, what are some possibilities for addressing some of these subnational issues, what might they be?
Should I take that?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, one piece of it that I've been thinking about is to try to stimulate and recognize an active civil society sector. I've been doing some work related to Iraq and in Egypt, and these are countries that don't have a robust civil society. And part of civil society is, including maybe universities, is keeping the government sort of honest, right? But also foregrounding the idea that environmental issues as a whole matter, but then environmental issues, around water, and being able to bring, and sort of elevate the importance of that. Some people, I kind of hate this formulation, but they say, the low politics and high politics. So water tends to stay at the low politics level in a lot of countries that are most affected. And then it's how can that be increased and brought more to the attention of policymakers. And I think that a real part of that is civil society as well.
Melissa, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking to the second half of the question, which scaling up to the transboundary level with shared waters, and linking that to like Spain and Portugal and the political regime shifts. And I feel like that is the really importance of institutional capacity in that place. So do you have the institutions in place? Do you have the legal instruments in place? And then it's also the relationships. So my own work looks at, which had a book that came out in 2022 on this topic, looking at effective cooperative processes. And what that research really showed is that it's not just these legal and institutional frameworks that we're setting up, but it's also the relationships that we're developing as well. So you can have a trusting foundational relationship that is supported by adequate institutions, such as a river basin organization, a legal arrangement where you have early warning, for example, put into that, you have a conflict resolution mechanism, you have allocations, all of these different types of elements that can really help to hold up and allow your cooperation to persist if a political regime shift happens. So that is providing the foundation and the stability for that. And then, as Marcus was saying, having an entry point for civil society to bring those voices from the subnational level to the international level as well.
So I think that's a great segue into our next question, which is what does institutional capacity actually mean? What are some good indicators of this? What are the parts of it that really matter when we're thinking about mitigating water conflict?
I guess I can start and maybe talk about institutional capacity at the transboundary level. When we're talking about it within the context of our research, generally we're thinking treaties, agreements, legal arrangements, basin organizations, so some sort of institutionalized cooperation, and then the relationships. So the political history between the states that they might have already had, for example, whether that's broader or specific to the transboundary resource itself. So that's generally what we're thinking. The quality of institutional capacity can range wildly. So what that treaty or legal arrangement has within its scope, what spatial area it covers, the frequency of meetings, the financial backing to the organization. So the level of institutional capacity can wildly change. And so those are all things we try and measure when we look at hydropolitical vulnerability from a transboundary standpoint. So there definitely is very much differences on capacity. And then the states themselves can have their own different levels of technical, financial, human capacity as well that will contribute and change the potential power imbalance within the institutional framework.
Marcus, you want to weigh in? It seems like non-state violent actors don't play well into this framework idea of institutional capacity.
Yeah, that's true. I think that one of the areas I would double down on is institutional capacity related to training. Hydrologists, part of the idea of resilience to water or even climate change is having people domestically that are trained in the science, that are able to be engineers and able to deal with that. And a couple of the countries that I've looked at, they're experiencing brain drains, which is not surprising when there is fragility and instability, but too many sort of too few schools in the United States and in Europe are teaching, technical water issues. And then a lot of these countries are kind of, bleeding experts that would be involved in that area.
So this is really for all of you, but Penny, there's a second part of this question that I think maybe fits into the grievance framework you've talked about, which is, what if there's a big difference in capacity on different sides of a conflict or among different actors who are potentially going to be involved in a conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking that actually as Melissa was explaining the institutional capacity at the international level, and like drawing on some of what Marcus was saying about the environmental peace building aspect, like using water as an entry point to build bridges across groups that might be at odds with one another. And I think there are lessons that we can draw from that, even down to the subnational level. Because ultimately conflict is it's seeking redress. It's seeking some kind of redistribution of power or financial capacity or cultural recognition. And so building institutional capacity across and like within groups that might be socially disparate from one another offers an entry point into redistributing some of the power that folks are seeking to gain through the use of their conflict. And so like, because ultimately what happens is if you have a group that is like one class has all of the hydrologists and they're the ones who know what's going on with the water, and then you've got another group like even Syria and like the sort of technocrat class in Syria versus the farmers, and the farmers had on the ground knowledge and the Syrian technocrats had more institutional knowledge, and like that wasn't being shared. And one of the grievances was like the farmers know that there's information that they're not getting. And they're like clamoring for information. Even still, like you see it in the news right now, like farmers just clamoring for data and they can't get it. So using that, like whoever is in power needs to accept some level of compromise, but they want that compromise in order to ameliorate the conflict. That's why the conflict is happening. So they have some incentive to do so, but we can draw lessons from this peace building, from this from this like institutional capacity building like vertically within a country to address disparities between different groups within that country.
One piece I wanted to add to that is the, structure. So the power structures in a lot of countries are ignoring the contributions, especially of women. So there's a big gender, factor to this. And the way that in a lot of local areas, the women are those that have the most experience with household uses of water, maybe even agriculture, localized agriculture. And so systems that, discriminate against women and their contributions to peace building or water policies at the local level is something that's been really detrimental and really understudied.
So I think, again, your questions are great. Keep them coming because they are feeding right into this conversation. We have a question that really gets at this development versus diplomacy question as we think about alleviating or reducing the likelihood of conflict. Do we know if it makes a difference when we look at sort of physical development interventions like hunger alleviation or even education, as opposed to governance or social institutional interventions? Does one of those work better? Do you need them both? Do we even know? Come on.
That's a
You
million
can spitball on this.
I can speak a little bit to the transboundary piece of that. What we've seen is that a lot of development or even kind of foreign ministries have actually, so whether they're foreign ministry development funded agencies or whether they're, intergovernmental organizations that are funding projects to support and create institutional capacity. So we have seen that quite a bit in the last several decades of funding for the creation of river basin organizations, support for supporting negotiations to create a treaty or a legal arrangement. And in some cases, those have been quite successful in maintaining the support and creating an institution. But we've seen other instances where as soon as that funding or that drive falls from the international organization or the foreign aid agency, that cooperation doesn't continue to persist. So often it's being a donor-driven agenda rather than a local agenda for that particular basin and with those particular states. So there's both, I would say, at the interstate level.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Penny?
Yeah, and like this is top of mind because it's what I've been reading most recently. So forgive this bias, but inequality is such an incredible driver of conflict. Like the research is unequivocal at this point. So whatever kind of water intervention you're seeking to carry out has to address inequality in some way, particularly between groups. I have 12 different thoughts that are all fighting to come out at the same time. But yeah, so like if your intervention is technical, then you can't prioritize one group over another with your technical solution, or you will foment more conflict inadvertently. If you're building institutional capacity within one group and not another, it's doing the same thing. So like we have to think long and hard about the interpersonal and intergroup dynamics of whatever intervention we seek to carry out, lest we inadvertently create more conflict.
So we don't have too much longer, and I want to close by letting each of our panelists say a few words. And my prompt, although you're welcome to talk about whatever you want, is this water wars narrative hasn't gone away. It hasn't gone away at the transboundary scale. It hasn't gone away at the subnational scale. So, you know, if you want to comment on why you think that is, or where you think the research or the narrative is going, or the reality is going, I would love to hear about that. Marcus, you're smiling. You want to start out?
Yeah, I mean, nothing funny about that. You know, I would say, again, you know, I go back to this idea that there is increased water scarcity. So I feel like, you know, I can't explain necessarily why the myth of interstate water wars has persisted, but I do think that we're, you know, again, we're at kind of an inflection point when you look at the impacts of climate change. And I think that that's been a little bit of a driver now, you know, in the literature and people really taking a look at, you know, what the future holds, both on the, you know, shared river basin level, but also on the subnational level.
Melissa, Penny, go for it.
I'm gonna go first, and then Melissa could close us out. I think the myth persists because water is so human. We all need it. It's all like it's spiritually, culturally, beyond just needing it to drink. Like we're drawn to it. It's the kind of narrative that's gonna get into people in ways that they might not even be conscious of. And the idea of fighting over it is like, on the one hand, it's very compelling, but it's also very scary. Like nobody wants this to happen. And I think that like that very human, very deep attachment that we have to water helps to perpetuate this idea.
Great.
I mean, I agree with both Marcus and Penny. I think the climate change piece is provided fuel for resurgence, if you will, of the water wars narrative, because it allows us to think more environmentally deterministically, which I think as a species, as humanity, we like to blame other people, other things like nature, climate change, something else for our challenges, even though a lot of them are reflected on how we manage that resource and how we utilize that resource. But it's a lot easier to say, well, that conflict happened because climate change. When there were still things that could have been done, or there were social, economic, or political factors that were really the underlying driver, as Marcus's example of the Syria case earlier. So I think that is that a willingness to essentially blind ourselves to an environmentally deterministic narrative is probably one of the reasons why I see the water wars narrative persisting. And it sells newspapers, right?
It does. I mean, look, here we are, and all these people are with us. I want to thank Marcus, Penny, and Melissa for joining us today. Thank you so much for sharing your insight. This has been fascinating and really fun. And I want to thank all of our participants for being here today and asking questions. I think this has been a really great Water Wars webinar. This is part of GWSC's quarterly deep dive webinar series, so I hope you'll join us again. When you exit the webinar, you'll see a survey pop up. So if you could let us know what you thought about today's event, that will certainly help us with our future programming. And I really also want to take a moment to talk about Georgetown's Master of Science in Environmental and International Affairs program, which Marcus directs. So this is a 12-month residential program in Washington, D.C. It integrates training in international affairs and the environmental sciences in a single interdisciplinary program. I love me a good interdisciplinary program. Each course integrates with both disciplines, and we're actually trying to make things better. So program graduates will be equipped with the latest scientific and analytic tools combined with international perspectives and experience, and be ready to pursue careers in public, private, nonprofit, and international organizations. So there's information about that at eia.georgetown.edu. The application deadline is May 1st. You should really think about it, or you should spread the word to people who would be interested. And I'll just end by saying, if you want more information about the Global Water Security Center, we're online at ua-gwsc.org. And we really appreciate your joining us today. So thank you again to our fantastic panelists for taking the time to share this. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.